Everybody, and as noted on the screen, I'm Kenneth Lomp, and I'm the current president of the CRPO. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can, each in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'm pleased to welcome you to this, the second of 9 town halls that we will be hosting in this fiscal year. Our first session was on May 24th, and more than 240 registrants signed in to hear the presentations. Made by staff on the work that has been going on at the college and the work that is planned for the coming year. The recording of that session, along with the responses to questions that were posed in that session, is available. Today's session will cover the regulatory framework and regulatory governance. Staff has responses to questions that were posed through the SurveyMonkey before today's meeting. Thanks to those of you who took the time to help shape the content of the session. CRPO is a later wave college. The RHPA came online in 1995. CRPO followed in 2015. This means that we have been able to benefit from the learning from colleges that were created when the RHPA was first introduced. For those of you who attended the first town hall, you know that I'm in my second term as president and that my tenure goes back to the days of the transitional council. In those days, we were all appointed by the Minister of Health to the council through the Public Appointments Secretariat. As will be discussed a bit later, all council members are now elected and only public members are appointed by the Secretariat. By the time I joined the Transitional Council in 2013, much of the foundational heavy lifting work had been done, or at least initiated by those who were on council before me. That's not to suggest in any way that everything was set and ready to go. Far from it. The college has undergone massive change in those 11 years, as has the profession. Regarding the latter, I pointed out in the first town hall that we were initially expecting 3,500 RPs and RMHTs. RMHT is now a defunct category. The college now has over 13,500 registrants and continues to grow. College staff has also grown nearly tenfold from 4 in 2011, hard to manage, but it was 4 according to the 2010-11 annual report and the Transitional Council, to nearly 40 now. Along with this growth has come complexity, sophistication, and modernization. In practical terms, this means the CRP was more easily able to shift into a more responsive way of regulating. This has included a shift to a right touch risk-based model. I chair the QA committee and one of the ICRC panels. For ICRC, the right touch approach has had a tremendous impact on our deliberations and outcomes. For QAC, the risk-based model allows us to assess all of our registrants over a period of time with a much less intrusive approach, the CBA. Then the random peer practice reviews that allowed the college to assess only a small percentage of registrants in the past. An adoption of the competence-based model for council and committee members, and finally, increased recruitment of non-elected council members in order to ensure diversity of lived experience, clinical modality, and communities of practice. These are professional members that are recruited by the college for the various committees and working groups and are not appointed by the Appointments Secretariat. We know that registrants have questions about how the college operates, how we get the right council and committee workforce to the table, and ultimately how we ensure we are making decisions in the public interest. Much of the above will be covered in today's session as it relates to governance. So the slides with the town hall schedule are up on the screen. All of the sessions will be recorded and available on the college's YouTube channel, so they can be accessed later. You'll see email and website updates for the upcoming sessions, and you're encouraged to keep track of them. Provide feedback on questions you would like to see answered in these sessions. So your input is critical because it drives what we will be presenting in the town halls. So keep that in mind, and hopefully all of you, as many of you already have been, are engaged in the process. We are pleased to have the opportunity to engage with you and look forward to connecting over the course of the year. On that note, I will turn it over to Amy and Deb.
Thanks, Ken. Excuse me. So as Ken mentioned, my name is Amy. I'll be presenting on the regulatory framework, focusing on council and committee roles. So the CRPO regulates registered psychotherapists in Ontario with a duty to serve and protect the public interest. In the regulatory context, this primarily means that the regulator is doing all that it can to ensure that practitioners provide safe, competent, and ethical care. This role differs from the professional associations who are there to advocate for registered professionals. Deb will speak to that more later in the presentation, but the CRPO's mandate is public protection, and we come back to this mandate often. Moving on to the sources of authority that govern the work of the CRPO. CRPO is a creature of statute, meaning that we draw our mandate from and must comply with the relevant legislation. So in our case, and noted on the slide here, is the Regulated Health Professions Act. It's the common legislative framework for all regulated health professions in the province. It's sort of overarching, and each profession has their specific act. So in our case, it is the Psychotherapy Act. Profession-specific acts are designed to protect the use of title, to define the profession's scope of practice, and to dictate any profession-specific controlled acts that the profession has access to. So in the case of CRPO, the Controlled Act of Psychotherapy. Regulations and bylaws are written by the College Council, so they sort of fit. If you're sort of imagining a pyramid, the Regulated Health Professions Act is at the top. Under that is the Psychotherapy Act, and under the Psychotherapy Act is where the regulations and bylaws come in. The regulations and bylaws are written by College Council. CRPO has 3 regulations: professional misconduct, quality assurance, and registration regulation. Those regulations do have to go through quite a lengthy process to get them approved by council, submitted to the government, and then working through the government's process to get them approved by cabinet. So it is quite a lengthy process. Why we only have 3 of those regulations at the moment. And then, so at the bottom of the pyramid, there would be, the bylaws govern how the college operates and deal mainly with administrative matters such as elections, procedures, fees, the public register, finance. Bylaws also include the code of conduct and how committees are composed, a great deal on the elections process. So lots of information that's relevant to registrants embedded in the bylaws. And sort of at the bottom with the least amount of regulatory force is the professional practice standards. The development of standards of practice is a requirement in the Regulated Health Professions Act, and the focus is largely on items that are rooted in the legislation, such as confidentiality, consent, record keeping, things of that nature, and they set the minimum expectations that must be met by RPs in Ontario. Policies and guidelines are developed by the CRPO committees. They provide a framework for consistent decision-making and implementation, and they really do act as an important tool for council and committees to regulate and to protect the public. Policies and guidelines often describe in greater detail issues that are set out in legislation, regulation, or in the bylaws. So what is council's role? Council is the governing body of the CRPO, meaning that council makes decisions related to setting registration requirements, developing standards of practice, running programs to ensure that a health professional's knowledge and skills are up to date. The college also, a large part of the college's role is to receive and investigate complaints from the public and disciplining registrants when it is necessary to do so. Council also develops and monitors regulations, policies, and business systems for the CRPO. Council's duties are supported by a number of statutory and non-statutory committees and working groups, as well as by CRPO staff. So who sits on council? Right now, we have 9 professional members who are elected, and we have 5 public members who are appointed by the Public Appointments Secretariat. The 9 professional members are from one of our 8 electoral districts, and though we have 5 public members now, often we have 6. So these individuals who are elected or appointed serve on about 2 to 3 of the college's of the college's statutory and non-statutory committees. So they serve on council and a sort of small selection of committees. And they are able to contribute their professional and personal life experiences to the committee decision-making process and to discussion. Individual council members have no authority on their own. The authority really comes from council itself. We also have about 40, I think about 35 non-council committee appointments serving on statutory and non-statutory committees and working groups. And this also includes 6 adjudicators who are appointed to the discipline and fitness to practice committees. These folks have a diverse range of expertise and experiences, and having their sort of input is really significant for the decision making that takes place at the committee level. So I'll talk a little bit more about the elected professional members. So each year, the CRPO holds an election in May or June. We have an election open right now. The last day to vote is tomorrow. So if you're in District 5, just a little bit of a plug to please to cast your vote. So as I noted, we have 9 elected members. There is 1 position available per district. We have 8 electoral districts, except for the Toronto district has 2 available positions. We have 2 Toronto folks who are on council, and RPs that are interested in serving on council are invited to submit a nomination package. The nomination package consists of the eligibility criteria, details on conflict of interest, including a candidate statement, completing competency self-assessment and pre-candidacy questionnaire, And once they submit this nomination package, staff and the registrar and the nominations committee will review the submissions, and those folks can run for election. They are elected for a 3-year term, and they can serve a maximum of 3 consecutive terms. So the public appointees, as Ken mentioned at the start, they are, we have 5 of them at the moment, and the public appointees are members of the public that serve on provincial agencies and other entities. So they are appointed through the Public Appointments Secretariat, through the PAS website. The names and agencies of public appointees are posted on the PAS website, and folks from the general public are invited to apply to be a public appointment. So they're appointed by the PAS, the Public Appointments Secretariat, and the college doesn't have any input on who is appointed. But the public members are expected to meet the same fiduciary obligations as the elected professional members, regarding being prepared for meetings, thinking strategically, acting in the public interest, declaring conflicts of interests as they arise, etc. And the public appointees are remunerated by the HBS, the Health Board Secretariat. So I'm going to pass it over to Deb to respond to one of the questions that we received in the survey that we sent out prior to this town hall. So pass it over to Deb.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning, everybody. I'm Deb Adams. I'm the registrar. I'm going to speak later on some specific, getting tongue-tied, some specific slides, but I'm just popping in to answer questions as we go through. As Amy said, we're trying our best to make sure that we cover the specific items that people are interested in as part of the presentation. So we've tucked a few of these questions in. So I'm actually really happy to have this question. It gives me the opportunity to speak to a couple of different issues. Firstly, as Amy noted, there are defined districts and council seats are tied to the geography that they comprise. We don't have any say over that at this point. It would mean, we'd have to retool those districts in order to change the way that the province was carved up vis-a-vis the council seats. It's important to note that council elections are required by the RHPA, so by the Regulated Health Professions Act, and that's true of all the health colleges in Ontario, although there is discussion and has been for some time about doing away with elections since they are not really considered to be best practice in terms of how professional self-regulation happens. So just briefly, as Amy sort of pointed out, registrants have the opportunity to stand for election in their district every 3 years. That's as the term cycle goes through. We do encourage everyone to participate. We've been offering webinars more recently over the last couple of years, including webinars where racialized members of council have generously made themselves available to speak to colleagues who are interested and who want the opportunity to speak to someone from an equity deserving community who's already on council and can speak to that experience. We also have a really extensive onboarding process. Part of that is that we've added in some pre-candidacy requirements as dictated by the government. Amy runs that part of the work that we do. And while it is work for folks, it's an opportunity for people to really understand what it is they're signing up for. Informed consent, important in regulation as in psychotherapy. So we really want people to know what it is that they're signing up for. So the blunt answer to this question is that it's RPs who decide who's going to be on council. And so, if people want to see representation outside urban centers and different areas of the province, then folks need to run, and then the registrants in their districts need to vote for them. So that's sort of the short answer. I think the longer piece, again, and coming back to best practices and governance, is that we do have the ability to recruit professionals to be part of committees, although they don't sit on council, so they don't, strictly speaking, have a governance role. They do get to set policy and make decisions about matters that come before the council. We actually have more than 38 non-elected appointees at this stage. So 3 to 1, those folks outnumber the elected members who are on council. And so we're recruiting actively each year. We look at what the committees need and we recruit at the direction of the committee and the committee chair and the executive committee to make sure that we have that diversity of perspective that's needed at committee tables. Amy's got the next slide on that around sort of the really specific details about non-council appointments. So we are working on this, but it's a great question, and I'm happy to see that, you know, to be able to say that we're making progress on this front. So Amy, I'll pass it back to you so you can speak to the non-council appointment process.
Thanks, Deb. So the bylaws state that council may appoint registrants who are not members of council to any committee at their pleasure. There, as Deb noted, there are 36 or 38 non-council members serving on various committees. We have 15 who are appointed to the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group, and the remaining are scattered on the Inquiries, Complaints, and Reports Committee. We have some on the Registration Committee, Examination, Quality Assurance. So lots of committees do have some non-council appointees who are offering their time and contributions to those committees. Non-council member recruitment is overseen by the Nominations and Elections Committee. And as Deb noted, it's something that we've been doing annually since, I think, 2019 was when we started doing it regularly. And typically we're looking for, it typically happens in the fall around September, October. And typically we look for specific knowledge, skills, and experience to contribute at the committee level discussions. So working with chairs and staff, determining where any gaps in knowledge on the committees, or particularly for the last call out that we did, the DEI working group had specific criteria for folks that they wanted to see represented at the DEI working group level. So as Deb noted, the CRPO does work to attract, retain, and develop competent and diverse council and committee members. A diverse council that includes people of all sort of genders, races, ages, sexual orientation, cultural backgrounds. Having that variety of perspectives, you know, ultimately we hope creates more informed decisions, and that's definitely a priority for the college. So we hope to promote an inclusive and safe environment for discussion and deliberation to foster that diversity of perspectives. And also, as Deb noted, we're aware that council diversity is an issue just through the nomination and election process. But we welcome candidates who are not only knowledgeable, skilled, and experienced, but folks who would enhance the diversity of council to cultivate that wide range of perspectives and experiences. I should also note that we have those 6 expert adjudicators who are public appointees. These folks are lawyers who chair the discipline hearings as part of a tribunal model that the CRPO is evaluating and participating in. So briefly, this disciplinary model allows us to ensure that we have the needed expertise and appropriate separation of the college's discipline work from the college's disposition of matters that come through complaints and reports. So we talked about council's role in making decisions related to the setting registration requirements, developing standards of practice, running the QA program, and handling complaints. Council's duties are supported by a number of statutory committees and non-statutory committees and working groups, as well as CRPO staff. So here on this slide, we have our 7 statutory committees. I'll read the list: client relations, discipline, executive, fitness to practice, inquiries, complaints and reports, quality assurance, and registration. The majority of the work of council is conducted by committees who make recommendations to council. These 7 committees are statutory committees. These are committees that the legislation requires the college to have in order to support the core regulatory functions. Each committee has a terms of reference that are reviewed and either revised or affirmed each year. And the committees also develop work plans based on the college's larger strategic plan. Here we have our non-statutory or our standing committees. They support the work of council and help to carry out its responsibilities. So we have the DEI working group, the examination committee, nominations and elections committee, and the professional practice working group. Those are our 4 non-statutory committees or working groups. Council has the authority to establish committees and working groups. And they establish their own terms of reference to articulate their mandate. So at this point, I will pass it over to Deborah to talk about council member competencies.
Thanks, Amy. So again, I'm Deb Adams. I'm thrilled. I'm seeing the numbers going up. We're seeing people sign in, so it's great to have this participation. As Amy said, I'm going to talk about council competencies as part of the regulatory approach. So on the next slide, we've got the competency materials detailed. So Amy's sort of given you the scaffolding within which we work. And so this is sort of the meat on the bones, as it were, about how council and committees work together. So council sets the strategic direction and really has the roadmap to public protection laid out for the college on a 3-year cycle. So there's a real high level of accountability involved in this. We report on the work that we do. Our decisions are subject to the scrutiny of an appeals board, as well as, obviously government oversight. And so we really need council and committee members to have the optimal mix of skills, knowledge, and experiences to be able to contribute to good governance, to good decision making, and to good public protection. So as part of that, and in terms of getting towards governance modernization, instead of just relying on the group of people who were there to have the skills, we actually developed a competency matrix for committees, for council, and also for panel work. It directs the composition of committees. Some of the defined competencies include understanding governance, finance, risk management, critical thinking. Some of them are general board competencies, the kinds of things that you would imagine developing for any board or governance work that someone does. Many of them are very specific to regulation. So we know that people are not necessarily going to show up with that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the education and the training and professional development that gets offered to people who work with the council and the committees. We also have staff, external legal counsel, and other experts who provide support specifically in the areas that are pretty niche and are relative to the kinds of work that are required by the legislation that we operate under. The key thing, though, that I really want to emphasize, as Amy pointed out, it's the role of council and committee members to be decision makers. All the staff and outside experts are there to provide information to support and inform that decision making, but ultimately council and committee members are the ones who make those decisions. So in addition to being aspiring to developing the competence set that we've described, we ask members to consider the mix of skills and experience that are needed at each committee based on the work that they do. So the registration committee, for example, we're looking for people who have come through different routes of education. Certainly with the examination committee, that's the same. We want to make sure we've got somebody who did a bridging program, someone who's trained internationally, so that perspective is there and part of the decision making. Candidates are required when thinking about running for an elected seat on council to complete a competency self-assessment as part of their nomination package. We use the competencies very clearly in that way. As I said, it provides the candidates with the opportunity to highlight any of the skills, knowledge, and experience that they have, so that when they're talking to colleagues about voting for them, they can really tie their, their suitability to the position back to those competencies. It also highlights for them any areas where they might have development work to do, so they know what they're signing up for in the way of professional development and continuing education. Council and committee members are supported in developing and enhancing those skills, those competencies through ongoing education. We do a lot of that at each committee meeting, at each council meeting. We have specific education days set aside, as well as a growing library of resources that we ask council and committee members to avail themselves of in order to make sure that they are ready to go. So the key here is that council members and committee members invest a lot of time over the course of their term with the college, and the college reciprocates that and matches the investment with the resources that we have available to make sure that people are comfortable and ready to go in terms of making decisions. I'll talk a little bit about the evaluation process that goes into that, but on the next slide, we've got a really good question around bias. And so I'm happy to have this one as well to be able to answer it. Council invests, as I said, a lot of time in training, making sure they're able to identify their own biases and the biases that their colleagues might bring to the table. We've had a lot of trainings. We work with a DEI consultant. Our legal counsel is very well versed in this, as well as expertise on staff. And so we do a constant check around bias and conflict of interest. We actually have a very specific and formal conflict of interest process where we check against all matters. Specifically, when something comes to a panel, we look at any involvement that a member of a committee or panel might have had with the registrant coming forward as part of that matter, whether it's registration, quality assurance, or complaint or discipline. And we look at all levels. So was there contact as a student, as a clinical supervisor, in a group practice, or generally as part of a community. So the panel members are pre-screened and they won't be involved in a matter if there is any potential conflict of interest. And certainly they can recuse themselves at any point in the process. When it comes to policy, it's the same conversation. Is there anything in the particular member's sort of professional or personal life that would put them in a position where they really can't make an unbiased decision? You can see documentation on this whole conflict of interest check as it relates to council meetings in each package. We actually go through the exercise, and it's not just a checking of a box. We actually go through the exercise at every council meeting. You'll hear Ken at the beginning of the council meetings asking people to make sure that they've done their conflict of interest check, that they've acknowledged that they don't have any, and if they have, that that they're going to remove themselves from discussion about that part of the agenda. So we're very careful about it. If you click next on the next slide, it's very tiny, but I wanted to put this in front of you. It is a link, and so you can have a look at it when we circulate the slides. But this is part of the competence matrix. You can see that at the top, it talks about being a critical friend, or maybe you can't see it. I'm sorry, it's very small, as I said. But really the idea with the critical friendship is that the mandate and the mission of an organization is not going to advance if people aren't holding each other and themselves accountable. And so we ask everybody to be critical friends to each other, council members, committee members, and staff, to make sure that we really are calling each other out if there seems to be a bias. It's great to work with psychotherapists. Everybody's really quite adept at having difficult conversations on that front. And so bias is something that's top of mind all the time for us, and something that we work really hard to make sure that we're checking for. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about good governance and how that works. So good governance really does start with a clear sense of mandate. If you know what you're doing, you know what your decision-making points are, you know the framework within which you work, you're well set for good governance. And as I said, I think Amy's presentation sort of showed the lane that we have is very well defined by government and legislation. So for the college, it's straightforward, public protection. This clear purpose is shared by staff, council, committee members, and is the beginning and the end of all the work that we do. You'll often hear us ask, so what's the public protection issue here? If you look at our briefing notes in the council materials, which are posted before every meeting, you'll see that every single briefing note starts with a statement around the public protection rationale. If we can't explain why we're doing something under the umbrella of public protection, it's probably not within our mandate. So this slide, although pretty basic, is actually one of my favorite concepts. It's looking at the healthy tension that needs to exist between the three pillars that are required for a sustainable profession. So we're a system that can be compared to a three-legged stool made up of education programs. CRPO is the regulatory body, and then professional associations. So what we're looking for is excellent education to create competent practitioners, rigorous regulation to ensure accountability and public trust, so our job, and then strong associations to advocate for the needs of the profession. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the questions too. If one of those legs is overly long or not long enough, the stool is going to topple. So it's really important that we look at all three of those things existing in a balance. We wouldn't want, as the regulator, to overshadow what the professional association is doing. We wouldn't want the education programs to not be out there directing what excellent education and competence development looks like. So it's really important in the grand scheme of things to make sure that that healthy tension exists. We liaise regularly with the associations. We have regular meetings with them, with their representatives. We also do an annual meeting with them. We also have great connections with the education programs. We just wrapped up in May an annual update meeting that we have with the education programs, and we're in constant contact with them through the recognition process and through sharing of information at every opportunity possible. So good questions on the next slide. I want to get to those. There's quite a few of them. But this is talking about, I think, mandate and understanding what we do. So the first question around having a doctorate and whether the college is advocating or challenging legislation so people can use their doctor title in a clinical setting. Short answer is no. CRPO is not working to challenge legislation on that front. That would really be seen as advocating for the profession, which is so not the role of the regulator. It's something that the professional associations could be doing, but the government, and in fact the public, would have reason to question our motivation as a public protector if the college was seen to be doing this. We need to protect the public by registering competent practitioners, addressing deficit in competence first, and so that's sort of what we do. And so you won't see us advocating for the doctor title, but if that's something that, sort of through the evolution of the profession needs to happen, happy to see the associations to do that and to take direction from government if and when they decide that that's something else. So how can CRPO start providing free, high quality trainings? Also excellent, happy to speak to that. As I said, our first order of business is to protect the public, and by registering and monitoring registering competent people and monitoring continuing competence, we sort of start off at ground level. The college has to date been very focused on building infrastructure. The grandparenting process is not that far ago, so registration was a big part of what we were doing, and we've been building capacity. We recently, as Ken suggested, switched to a risk-based approach to the quality assurance program, which frees up resources in terms of being able to look at education. So we are actually starting to build some capacity to develop education on this front. We have done ad hoc sessions in the past. One that comes to mind is the electronic practice webinar we did at the beginning of the pandemic. Excuse me. And we developed peer circle cases that dealt with informed consent and information sharing in the last cycle. I would note that any and all education that we have developed and that we will develop in the future is going to be related to regulatory obligations and requirements. We're never going to provide clinical education. It's not the regulator's role to do this. Wouldn't be feasible given the myriad of modalities that exist. And that's what your education programs and associations are there for. We are going to partner again with the Ontario Association of Mental Health Professionals to develop cases for peer circles and to start offering those again with different cases and topics in the fall. We also have 2 new sessions under development that are going to come forward in the fall. They're related to guidance that's upcoming around medical assistance in dying and psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. We'll be running those, as I said, in the fall once that guidance is ready to go. All of these things will be recorded so they can be watched at any point and made available to students and to practitioners when they're ready to use them. I want to address the myth that the College of Social Work provides funding. They do not. We get this question a lot. I would really like to see this question get answered and sort of out there in the world. The Ministry of Community and Social Services approved funding, I think around 2015, and they've been renewing it ever since. That funding for registered social workers was negotiated by the Association of Social Workers. It is administered through the association. The only involvement the college has, and I confirmed this with their registrar last week just to make sure we were totally on target with this, is that in order to access the funding, you have to be a registered social worker in good standing with the college. So that is it. There's no other involvement. As a regulator, just like CRPO, the College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers is not in the business of funding professional development for registrants. If this is something that registrants want to see happen, again, we would be more than happy to participate in the same way that social work does, but it's something that we are not in a position to advocate for. HST, another perennial question. The college did provide information to support the tremendous work that the associations did on this front. We've been supporting it in the background in terms of talking about scope of practice, talking about the different titles, providing information to the associations to use in their conversations with government. Our understanding is that in April, the federal government did table legislation that proposes to exempt both psychotherapy and clinical counseling therapy across the country from HST. Again, our understanding is that registrants will be eligible for this exemption in Ontario just by virtue of being registered with the college and in good standing. There is work to be done relative to the unregulated provinces, and we're looking at how we can support that so that the exemption happens across the country. And we will post information relative to the college's role in that when it's available. But in terms of this being a business-related issue and something that people, particularly in private practice, obviously will need to address, it's something that we'd encourage you to talk to your associations about. Last question around advocating for extended health coverage. So again, regulators do not get involved in remuneration or funding. It would undermine our role as protectors of the public if we were seen to be involved in compensation or funding for our members, our registrants. However, we do a great deal of work in the background around insurers. We answer questions. We make information available. In the past, staff have been involved with government funding around motor vehicle accidents and the insurance payments that go with that. We have written to various insurers. We respond to questions from the public to provide them with information if they're looking for support to get their particular coverage expanded to include psychotherapists. 7 or 8 years ago, when I first started, we got this question a lot because there were many plans that weren't covering psychotherapy. Part of the problem was that some national-based insurers require it to be regulated across the country, although that is shifting. We rarely get that question anymore. It seems to me that most third-party coverages have added psychotherapists in, and we will continue to respond to questions and provide information. I think the big piece here is that being regulated, being able to demonstrate that you're accountable is what the insurance companies are looking for. We know that they use the public register. We get questions from them about that fairly frequently. So we know that the insurance companies are looking to the regulator to make sure that people are regulated and in good standing in order to provide coverage, but we don't advocate. It's not something, advocate is not a word that is in the regulatory vocabulary for good reason. Next couple of questions, I think, and then we can move on from here. So this is interesting to me. These are 2 questions received in the same survey from obviously 2 different people. Feels like 2 sides to the same question, I think, and it's important to address the balance there. So what are we doing to make sure that RPs are maintaining their competence? And then why is the college requiring continuing competence obligations that are so onerous? So like all colleges, CRPO has a mandatory quality assurance program. That's something that's required of all of us by government and has been for some years. And so for us, as you know, it's 40 hours every 2 years, which works out to about 23 minutes a week if you were to do something every week. The basket of qualifying activities is considerable. It's experiential, it's didactic, it's self-directed, it can be modality specific, it can be entirely clinical. And it's for most registrants, is entirely self-directed. So the addition of the CBA, which is required once every 5 years, or the case-based assessment that Ken referenced, it is a new addition. I appreciate that anything new feels, like it could potentially be challenging. I will tell you that the recent results for the one that just finished were just astoundingly reassuring. Less than 3% of registrants struggled to get a passing assessment, and so only those folks will be going through reassessment. Everybody else will be given the clear sailing to go ahead and do whatever they want in the next 40 hours over 2 years. But the point of the CBA is to give RPs the opportunity to self-assess if they're as familiar with the standards as they need to be. As I said, we're seeing great results. And what that means is that those folks who are competent and familiar enough with the standards are actually doing exactly what they need to avoid complaints in terms of their knowledge and understanding and presumably their adherence to the standards. And so it's not what's being asked of CRPO's registrants is not more onerous than what's being asked of others. Other colleges use self-assessment. Some use a portfolio, so people are obligated to submit exactly what it is that they're doing over the course of their professional development cycle. Some colleges, for example, CPSO, work across a broader national front where they have accredited continuing education that's required of registrants. So all the colleges do have similar components. It's just, sort of specific to what their practice requires. With regards to the comments on the other side of the coin around overpopulation, this really, again, is not something that college has any business in commenting on. We're not here to regulate the labor market. The government would be quite rightly very concerned. I'd argue that as psychotherapists, you should be very concerned if there was any sense that the regulator was in there trying to restrict access to a profession or impact the labor market. For sure, we want qualified, competent practitioners. The gates to registration, which include clinical supervision and passing that national entry to practice exam, and then ongoing involvement in quality assurance to make sure that continuing competence in place is really critical to making sure that we have a competent workforce. And our complaints and reports would suggest that we do. Our compliance with the QA program would suggest that we do. And so while I appreciate that as new folks come on online and we see more professionals entering the field, there will be shifting in the way work happens, but it's not the college's job to restrict or control that. And I'd argue, since we still see wait lists for mental health services across the province, it would be very hard for us to argue in any way that there's an abundance of psychotherapists in the mix. So on to right touch regulation and the approach that we've adopted there. This is something that Ken spoke to briefly, but I want to provide a little bit of context around why this is important. The right touch to regulation was developed in the UK by the Professional Standards Authority. It was in response to the idea that regulation had become overly burdensome, that colleges or regulators in that country were wielding their authority too heavily, and that it was really squashing professionals' ability to work in their fields. So the idea with right touch regulation is that the role of the professional regulator is to work in the public interest by supporting professionalism and allowing it to flourish. So really providing resources like the CBA to allow people to self-assess and determine what it is that they need to do to address their practice. The right touch approach supports professionalism through the promotion of standards of competence and conduct, really making it clear what it means to be competent. And we take that direction from council. And when we did the recent overhaul of the standards from all of you folks, because we put that information out there and had so many iterations and good edits from registrants that were incorporated into the standard. So it really is the profession setting its own bar. We take action when those standards are breached. As often as possible, it's remediative action. It's not punitive action. The goal is to keep good practitioners in practice with the supports that they need. We have quality assurance requirements that continue to engage, we hope, registrants even over the long haul, and to make sure that they're current and they know what they need to know. We don't seek to address all aspects of risk. It really isn't possible for us to identify and respond to all of those things. We have things like mandatory reporting so that we're aware of issues that come up that may not make it onto the radar through clients. It gives you an opportunity as a registrant to be involved in that process. We can't prevent every possible thing that could go wrong, so we don't try to. We really leave it to the profession to self-regulate. That's why it's called self-regulation. The other piece too is that over-regulation can give a false sense of assurance and lead to increased risk. If practitioners think they don't have to be watchful of themselves and the work that's going on in their environment, then complacence can creep in, and that's when you see people not catching things ahead of time. So right touch regulation really forces us to be certain that the costs of regulation are worth the benefits that they bring. So with this in mind, Council developed a strategic plan, which I'll talk about on the next slide, to really direct the work that we do. So as I said before, one of the functions of Council is to establish overall direction and priorities for the organization. This creates that decision-making framework by which we measure our decisions. So Council uses the College Performance Measurement Framework, which I'll talk about shortly, to evaluate whether we're meeting all the targets we need to in our strategic plan. We have key performance indicators that we report on at council. If you watch a council meeting, you'll see staff talking about that. And in addition to strategic priorities, we also have regulatory objectives, which are on the next slide. These have been around for a while. We developed them in 2019. They set out more specific goals and priorities. They also talk about how we're going to achieve them. Any proposed initiative that comes before council will be understood through these objectives. So if we can't answer yes to these questions, then again, it's probably not something we should be doing. And if we go back to that right touch idea that I just talked about, it means that we won't, be bringing regulatory force to bear in places where the issue or the initiative doesn't really meet those regulatory objectives. So good questions on this front that I want to speak to. So this is about operations, right? People want to understand where we're spending their money, because the money that the college has really does come from registrants, right? All of our fees, all of our application fees, all of our renewal fees, that's where the revenue comes from. And I'll show you a slide in a couple slides where we break down that stuff. So funds are used for core functions of self-regulation: registration, monitoring, continuing competence, and responding to concerns raised by the public. We have obligations to see through every complaint and report that comes in. Even the ones where we take no action, we're still obligated by law to investigate and to come to a decision about those. It's very rare that we don't have to. It would have to be a frivolous and vexatious complaint in order for us to not address that. You can tune in next week to our town hall on the trauma-informed approach to understand more about that. We don't have time to talk about it today, but this really is the piece where we make sure that we have the funds to cover the things we're obligated to do. Payment options aren't viable. Credit card fees are already the 4th largest annual expenditures on the college's budget. Fees have not been raised since 2018. They will go up in June of this year, but over the course of the pandemic, we didn't raise fees. And a 2022 comparison of all the health regulatory college registration fees, we were less than 17 of the 26 colleges. So there are only 9 colleges that were charging less than we were. They are much bigger with, far more registrant base to spread the cost across. So really, at the end of the day, it's being regulated, and paying those registration fees is a cost of being in business as a regulated health professional. With regards to the emails, the last question around receiving support, emails are constantly monitored. We've actually had to insist that staff disconnect outside work hours since we weren't remote, so that they get a break. We noticed that was one of the, the things that was happening for everybody, was that creep of hours was starting to take place. I'm glad to be asked about the phones, though. Since going remote, we've been relying on a voicemail system that transcribes and forwards messages so that staff have continuous access to the content of those voicemails. Going forward, however, we're actually going to be implementing having triage folks answering the calls for each department, as well as a call scheduling link so people can book times to speak to staff that fits with their schedules. Finally, I'd note that the practice advisory service, which really is the main source of support for RPs, is a service that matches inquiries to an advisor. And so emails and calls have always been triaged there to make sure you're getting the right person when you have a question. So the next slide just breaks down how our budget comes online. And again, I apologize that this is very small. I realize if you've got a small screen, you're not going to see much of that, but we will make our these slides available so you can have a look. And all of this information, by the way, is always in our annual report, and it is twice a year when the budget is passed and when the audit is reviewed, included in college materials as well. So you could always see that. So registration fees make up $6.4 million. We did really well on interest this year. We had a good investment policy, so we're able to make $500,000 in interest there. This allows us to build our reserve fund so that we can see all those things through that we need to. Just really quickly on the next slide, and I'm conscious of time, so I'm moving quite quickly here. This is how money gets spent. So obviously, we are a knowledge industry. Salaries and benefits make up the biggest portion of what we're doing because we are people doing work. But then, as I said, the bank fees are $200,000, so which is why we can't split them up any further. ICRC, which is the screening of complaints and reports, is almost $1 million. Council and committee work is included in there. The sexual abuse therapy for funding, I'll point out, not a lot of money, but that's something that we're obligated to have available when there are allegations of sexual abuse by a registrant. So I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to actually skip ahead to the 30-second slide, Amy, if we can. This is areas of focus for 2024. That link that Amy just blew past for me is the College Performance Measurement Framework, again, live in the slide, so you'll be able to take a look at it and see what's going on. But these are the priorities for 2024. We have a lot going on. We'll continue to work on making sure that we have competent folks doing the work. We're doing some supporting resources for the professional practices, as I said. The DEI working group is a big part of what's going on in terms of making sure we're appropriately staffed and from a staffing and a council and committee perspective. We are working on the registered management system. We're improving that. We're going to see some more changes in the coming year. The trauma-informed review of regulatory processes, that's going to be presented at next week. Please come and have a listen to that. We'll be rolling out a peer coaching program as part of the quality assurance program, and we'll be evaluating that quality assurance program. And then we have a big bylaw review coming up. So you'll see us sending out requests to consult on that over the year, and really do welcome your input on that front. So I see that there are no open questions and that staff have answered 3 of the questions in the chat. Thank you for that, Mark. I'm afraid that brings us to the end of the hour. I'm certainly happy to stay on if there are questions that people want to answer. I think I'll pass it off to Ken to say thank you, and then we can leave the Zoom meeting open if people want to stay online and ask questions of us. I'm happy to do that for the next little while. So Ken, if I can pass it back to you for your final words.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, had to unmute there. So thanks, Deb. Thank you all for attending today and for your contributions. We hope you found today's session beneficial and that we answered your questions to your satisfaction. We look forward to seeing you all again at the next town hall, as Deb pointed out.